Australia started as a prison colony for British convicts. Today, it has one of the world's strongest banking systems, lowest government debt levels among developed nations, and ranks consistently in the top 10 for quality of life. How did a remote continent, initially populated by prisoners and their guards, transform into one of the most stable and prosperous economies on the planet? When you think of Australia, you probably picture kangaroos, surfers, and endless desert. But behind that exotic image lies one of the most unexpected economic success stories in modern history. The country has avoided recession for nearly 3 decades, weathered the 2008 financial crisis better than almost anyone else, and built wealth not just on resources, but on strategy. Yet today, cracks are appearing. Housing has become unaffordable for an entire generation. Manufacturing has largely disappeared, and the entire economic model depends on one crucial assumption: that Asia, especially China, will keep buying Australian resources forever. So what happens when that assumption breaks? How did Australia get here, and what threatens its economic miracle today? Hold on. Before we dive into this research, I need to know something. Where are you joining from, and what time is it there right now? Country, city, local time? Put it all in the comments below. I really want to see how global this is. Now, let's get into it. 2. In August 1768, a ship commanded by Lieutenant James Cook departed from an English dock. The official purpose of this voyage around the world was to observe the transit of Venus across the sun's disk in early June 1769 from the island of Tahiti. However, Cook, who had joined the Royal Navy back in 1755, received a secret order from the Admiralty: gather information about lands and sea routes in the southern Pacific Ocean and find the inhabitable southern continent. This mysterious and still undiscovered landmass was then called Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. The navigators crossed the Atlantic, then rounded Cape Horn at the southernmost point of South America, and after that landed in Tahiti. Having fulfilled the Royal Society's commission and visited New Zealand, Cook directed the ship into uncharted ocean waters heading south. On April 19, 1770, he reached the eastern coast of the continent that would later receive the name Australia. 10 days later, the crew landed in a bay at Botany Bay. Cook explored the eastern coast and, upon returning to Great Britain, reported favorable conditions for establishing a colony in these lands. The economic benefit of founding a British colony in Australia wasn't immediately obvious. The new colony was destined to become a prison. After the War for Independence began in the United States, the Americans refused to accept British convicts. The British government then decided to send prisoners to Botany Bay to solve the problem of overcrowded prisons. Moreover, Britain had another motivation: to establish itself in the southern Pacific and expand its commercial influence. In 1787, the First Fleet, a combined convoy under the command of Captain Arthur Phillip, left Britain. On board the ships were several hundred prisoners, naval and military crews, prison staff, and officials. In January 1788, the fleet reached the eastern coast of Australia. However, the coast of Botany Bay was deemed insufficiently suitable for founding a new colony. And on January 26, 1788, the entire First Fleet dropped anchor at the mouth of Port Jackson Harbor, later named Sydney Cove. It was at this location that the first British colony in Australia, New South Wales, was founded, and its first governor was Captain Arthur Phillip. The settlement was initially to be called Albion, but at the last moment the newly minted governor decided to name it Sydney in honor of Lord Sydney, who at that time was in charge of Britain's colonial affairs. The First Fleet was followed by a second, and then a third. The early years of Sydney's existence, like the colony as a whole, were difficult. Food shortages were common, diseases spread, climate adaptation was challenging. At first, the settlement's economy was heavily dependent on government supplies, and New South Wales itself, for approximately 20 years from its founding, was primarily a place of exile for convicts. But even during this period, the foundation for future development was being laid. The colony, which had become a prison for both convicts and their overseers, required maintenance. Agriculture developed based on land grants to senior officials and freed convicts. Prisoners were granted limited freedoms to produce various goods and services. Individual labor rights and property rights were recognized and guaranteed, which launched the process of market formation. The private economy gradually grew. Australia's development didn't proceed smoothly. Interest groups quickly appeared in the colony. Officers of the New South Wales Corps controlled trade in spirits and provisions. Their main player was John MacArthur, an ambitious adventurer who arrived with the Second Fleet. He acquired land and connections, and was the first to bring merino sheep to Australia, which would make Australia a future leader in the wool industry. Governors tried to limit his power, but unsuccessfully. Even after being sent back to England, MacArthur managed to wriggle out, avoid trial, and return with new ambitions. Then a new governor, William Bligh, tried to break his influence. The result was an unprecedented event, the Rum Rebellion of 1808, the only successful coup in Australian history. Bligh ended up in prison, and power temporarily passed into the hands of officers and MacArthur. But already in 1809, Lachlan Macquarie arrived in Sydney with a Scottish regiment. He restored order, disbanded the Rum Corps, sent MacArthur back to England, and began large-scale reforms. He built roads, schools, churches, founded new towns, and sent expeditions into the interior of the continent. MacArthur lost influence, but the sheep farming he created flourished, and the agricultural company he founded still operates today. It was with Macquarie that Australia's real breakthrough began, the transition from military administration to an economy that already promised to turn the colony into a prosperous country. In the 1820s, Britain was the world leader in textile manufacturing, a fruit of the Industrial Revolution. But any manufacturing requires raw materials, and the extraction of raw materials for British textiles flourished on Australian territory. Already in the 1830s, sheep's wool became the leading export of the young colony. The possibilities of earning huge profits in sheep farming attracted British capital to the economy. The colony grew richer, and its economy demanded expansion, and this demand was satisfied. Enormous government spending on transport, communications, and urban infrastructure contributed to intensive development of the New South Wales economy. By 1840, it became clear that the prison colony had to remain in the past. The time had come for commerce, entrepreneurship, and adventurism. Transportation of convicts from Britain stopped. Instead, immigration intensified, subsidized by the colonial government itself. Settlers arrived predominantly from Britain itself, bringing with them skills, knowledge, and technologies that contributed enormously to economic growth. Together with freed convicts, new settlers formed a free colonial society. 4 more British colonies were created on the continent: Western Australia, South Australia, Victoria, and Queensland. And Van Diemen's Land, formerly part of New South Wales and now Tasmania, became a separate colony with its own court and legislative council. In 1851, astonishing gold deposits were discovered in Victoria. News spread not only throughout the colonies, but beyond the continent. A flood of gold seekers poured into Victoria from all corners of Australia, later reinforced by adventurers from Europe. If during the period from the 1830s to 1850s, wool led exports, then starting from 1851 until the 1870s, it was gold. But this didn't lead to destruction of the agricultural sector. On the contrary, agricultural output grew. In South Australia, more and more wheat was grown, and in livestock colonies production switched to meat and tallow. Why? Simply because with the gold rush, the domestic market also grew substantially. Although extraction at Victoria's goldfields soon declined, deposits rich in ores and precious metals continued to be found throughout the continent. In New South Wales, silver, lead, and zinc were discovered. In Tasmania, copper. In Queensland, gold. And in 1893, deposits were opened in Western Australia that proved to be the richest gold fields on the continent. As easily extracted alluvial gold was exhausted, extraction shifted to companies that had the financial and organizational resources necessary to develop deep veins. Besides sheep farming, capital also flowed into mining. Due to the gold rush, the colonial population grew at a frantic pace. In just 10 years after gold was discovered in Victoria, the colony's total population more than doubled, and Victoria's largest city, Melbourne, surpassed not only Sydney in population, but also Chicago and San Francisco. Of course, this had a profound impact on all of Eastern Australia. Migrants of the gold rush period were mainly young men, which had long-term consequences for the construction industry. When the children of gold seekers grew up and started their own families, demand for housing accelerated sharply in the 1880s. In the early 1890s, this boom ended with a massive collapse of construction companies, mortgage banks, and other financial institutions. The economy of colonial Australia eventually recovered, and the 20th century loomed on the horizon. On January 1, 1901, the Australian colonies agreed to unite in a federation called the Commonwealth of Australia. 10 years of negotiations, consultations, and votes in colonial parliaments bore fruit. Already in 1907, the young federation received dominion status within the British Empire. This meant that the Commonwealth of Australia recognized the British monarch as head of state, represented in the country by a governor-general. However, the federation gained wide autonomy from the metropolis. After the creation of the Commonwealth of Australia, the new government received real levers of influence. It controlled tariffs on goods, labor disputes, wages, and immigration. This immediately changed the rules of the game. On one hand, barriers between colonies disappeared, and a unified market appeared. On the other hand, the White Australia policy was introduced, restricting the influx of non-European migrants. Politics quickly turned into a battle of interests. Workers, industrialists, and farmers were forced to negotiate. Thus appeared a special compromise, the Australian settlement. Workers were promised fair wages, and business received protection from foreign competition. As a result, domestic industry began to grow faster than the economy as a whole. But this model had a downside. Factories and plants often relied not on efficiency, but on protectionism. Australia went down the path of import substitution, tried to produce everything itself, but at the same time depended on purchasing modern equipment abroad, and therefore always needed foreign currency. In the 1920s, Australia's economy still relied on raw materials. The main export items were wheat and wool. During World War I, they sold at high prices. Europe, engulfed in war, desperately needed food and raw materials. But in peacetime, the situation changed. European countries quickly restored their agriculture, the shortage disappeared, and prices for Australian exports collapsed. As a result, the foreign currency the country earned abroad became insufficient, while payments on external debt accumulated during the war only grew. Australia faced a typical problem of resource-dependent countries trying to develop industry through import substitution. Foreign currency expenses exceeded foreign currency income. When the Great Depression struck, the crisis hit Australia especially hard. From 1929, raw material prices collapsed. Exports fell by almost 40%. Budget revenues dropped, and unemployment soared. By 1932, it reached 30%. In 1931, authorities adopted the Premier's Plan, cut spending by 20%, reduced wages and pensions, raised taxes, and essentially wrote off part of the debt. New protectionist measures were also introduced. This saved Australia's reputation in Britain's eyes and helped restructure the debt. But the price was a sharp drop in living standards. However, the state began to play a much larger role in the economy. Public works began, state enterprises were created, support for farmers increased. Natural resources continued for a long time to remain the most important source of foreign currency. But the Great Depression definitively ended the period when development of new lands and borrowing of technical innovations provided a reliable foundation for Australia's economic growth. The economy of the Commonwealth of Australia finally recovered only during World War II, facilitated by mobilization of labor resources and alliance with the United States, which provided a stable flow of orders for heavy industry products and stable supplies of necessary technologies and components. As a result, in 1945, the Australian economy was more industrialized than in the pre-war period. In just 157 years of its existence, Australia had traveled from prison colony through an agricultural raw material economy to full industrialization. After World War II, industrial production growth accelerated, spreading to sectors most characteristic of an advanced industrial economy. Australia began actively producing automobiles, electrical equipment, and steel products. The chemical industry developed. Industrial production peaked in the mid-1960s, constituting almost a third of national output. However, extractive industries remained key for exports. The post-war boom in the world economy sharply increased demand for commodities, which primarily created new opportunities for Australia's mining industry. Japan's economic miracle and the development of other East Asian economies opened a huge market for iron ore, coal, and mineral products. Britain's role as a key trading partner began to shrink. By the end of the 1960s, Japan had become the largest buyer of Australian raw materials, and the United States a key importer. Australia took advantage of the mining boom. The federal government pursued a policy of full employment, encouraged immigration, softened entry criteria into the country, and education spending increased. At the same time, protectionism intensified and by the 1960s reached its peak. Although Australia was one of the first participants in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the predecessor to the World Trade Organization, in practice the country hardly used its opportunities. As a result, the share of exports in GDP noticeably decreased. By the end of the post-war boom, Australia still depended on commodity exports and foreign investment to buy industrial products it didn't produce itself, and this determined its future. From the mid-1970s to the early 1980s, developed countries were hit by stagflation. Stagflation is characterized by rising inflation, high unemployment, and low growth rates. This sad fate didn't bypass Australia. True, it had even more problems than many other developed world economies. High tariffs, growing dependence on commodity exports, enormous social spending, increasing budget deficits, and, of course, high inflation. The country began to understand that reforms were needed. The trigger mechanism was falling export prices in the early 1980s. Because of this, it became harder for Australian producers to buy imported industrial goods for their products. During this period, imports consistently exceeded exports. The trade balance deficit only increased. Manufacturing stagnated throughout the 70s, but suffered especially from the crisis of 1982 to 83, when unemployment rose to almost 10%. This was the maximum since the Great Depression. Then, in 1983, a new federal government led by Bob Hawke attempted to restore the economy through an agreement with the union movement. We give you jobs, you restrain wage growth. Hawke, together with Treasurer Paul Keating, didn't stop there and began conducting broad reforms aimed at improving the efficiency of Australian companies. They promised to improve access to foreign financing, but in return, Australian firms would have to face competition from the external sector. Thus, costs should decrease, and exports of more profitable manufactured goods would increase, ensuring reduced dependence of the economy on commodities. In short, this was about eliminating trade barriers and opening the economy. Paul Keating colorfully warned the public, if all this isn't done, Australia will turn into a banana republic. In the 1980s and 90s, reforms in Australia went deeper and faster. The Australian dollar was floated, the financial system was deregulated, they stopped centrally setting wages, conducted tax reform, including a consumption tax to replenish the budget. Simultaneously, they privatized and restructured state corporations, eliminated state monopolies, and opened competition in transport and telecommunications. And the reforms bore fruit. The economy became much more open and competitive. Productivity increased substantially. The share of manufactured goods in exports increased, and the agricultural share decreased. Public finances stabilized, inflation and unemployment decreased, and Australia, after a difficult crisis in the early 1990s, entered a long growth cycle. True, behind all the positive effects of reforms was hidden a process of erosion of the country's industrial base. Services began to play an increasingly large role, especially in tourism, education, and finance. Incidentally, export of Australian educational services today is an important source of foreign currency. In certain periods, it's comparable in volume to commodity export items. Students from around the world come to get an education in Australia, but the share of manufacturing in GDP is shrinking. Holden, Toyota, and Ford, plants that opened in the post-war period, left the country between 2017 and 2021. There are many reasons here. High wages at Australian enterprises, falling ability to compete with direct automobile imports after opening the economy, and strengthening of the Australian dollar. But why does the Australian dollar strengthen? It's all about high demand for raw materials from Asia, especially China, which led to another mining boom. Moreover, in the period after the 2008 crisis until the coronavirus pandemic, Australia's central bank maintained relatively higher interest rates compared to other developed countries, which only intensified the inflow of currency into the country and strengthened the Australian dollar, and at the same time didn't conduct active currency interventions to restrain the strengthening exchange rate. And Australia has a strong banking system, transparent regulation, and compared to other developed countries, a low level of government debt. Because of this, investors from around the world view Australian assets as a kind of safe haven during periods of global instability. Besides the strengthening currency rate, Australia has other difficulties. One of them today is concentrated around the residential real estate market. On one hand, the explosive growth of housing prices is influenced by safe haven status and a favorable regime for real estate investments by foreigners. On the other hand, immigration policy. In the 1990s, there was a shift toward economic immigration. The reasons are clear. The population is aging. The country needs to attract skilled labor. A points system was introduced for selecting candidates. Points are affected by age, education, work experience, knowledge of English, and having a profession on a special list. After the September 11th attacks and the growth of illegal migrants, immigration policy was tightened. Illegal migrants are sent to special offshore immigration centers located in Nauru and Papua New Guinea. From there, they're deported by sea. At the same time, quotas for students and contract workers have recently increased. Migration to sparsely populated regions is stimulated with additional points and benefits. There are also special humanitarian migration programs. And since 2023, reforms have been conducted toward simplifying visa processes. Yes, thanks to such a policy, the share of skilled migrants grew from 30% in the 90s to over 70% today. But the migration flow is enormous. Migrants need housing, which ultimately only increases price pressure. As a result, today Australia is a country with low housing affordability, which is a significant problem for youth. And finally, the country has an acute problem of climate change. Wildfires in Australia are the scourge of the 21st century. In August 2019, the scale of fires significantly exceeded the average during the annual drought season, which lasts from December to March during summer in Australia. About 18 million hectares of forests burned, more than 2,500 structures, including residential homes. Dozens of people died, and hundreds of millions of animals. Given the challenges of climate change, Australia needs to actively invest in fire prevention and response measures. Here's what this entire journey reveals. 3 clear conclusions emerge from Australia's economic transformation. First, resources alone don't create wealth, institutions do. Australia succeeded not simply because it had gold, wool, iron ore, and coal. Dozens of resource-rich countries have those. Australia succeeded because from the very beginning, even as a prison colony, it established property rights, created functioning markets, and built institutions that channeled resource wealth into productive investment rather than elite consumption. The colony recognized individual labor rights and property rights early on, which launched market formation. When reforms came in the 1980s and 90s, they worked because institutional foundations already existed. Countries can't simply copy Australia's resource export model without first building the legal frameworks, transparent regulation, and stable political systems that make that model sustainable. Second, economic flexibility matters more than any single industry. Australia has repeatedly reinvented itself. From prison colony to wool exporter to gold rush economy, to manufacturing hub, to services and education powerhouse. Each transformation required painful adjustment. The 1980s reforms that opened the economy were politically brutal. Protections were stripped away, industries collapsed, unemployment spiked. But the willingness to adapt, to let uncompetitive industries fail, to float the currency and deregulate finance, allowed Australia to survive and thrive. The country that refused to reform, that clung to the Australian settlement's protectionist compromise, would have become exactly what Paul Keating warned, a banana republic. Today's challenge is whether Australia can maintain that flexibility. Manufacturing is gone. The economy runs on resources, education, finance, and real estate. When China's demand eventually falls, can Australia transform again? Third, safe haven status is both an asset and a vulnerability. Australia's political stability is extraordinary. The Rum Rebellion of 1808 remains the only armed seizure of power in the nation's history. No civil wars, no revolutions, just steady evolution. Combined with strong banks, low government debt, and transparent institutions, this made Australia a magnet for global capital, especially during crises. That capital inflow strengthened the currency, which made exports harder but imports cheaper. It also inflated asset prices, especially housing. Today, an entire generation of young Australians can't afford homes in major cities. The Safe Haven brand attracts skilled migrants, which drives growth but also intensifies housing pressure. The very stability that made Australia prosperous now creates inequality that could undermine that stability. Here's the warning. Australia's economic model rests on assumptions that may not hold. The first assumption is that Asia, particularly China, will continue buying Australian resources indefinitely. China currently takes about 35% of Australia's total exports. Iron ore and coal dominate. But China is slowing down. Its property sector, which consumed enormous amounts of steel, is in crisis. Its shift toward green energy threatens coal demand. And geopolitical tensions between Canberra and Beijing create risks that go beyond economics. If China significantly reduces purchases, Australia faces a terms of trade shock that could end its nearly three-decade run without recession. The second assumption is that immigration can continue at current levels without social or political backlash. Australia adds hundreds of thousands of people annually through migration. This supports growth, fills labor shortages, and keeps the population young. But it also strains infrastructure, inflates housing costs, and creates cultural tensions. Other developed countries have seen immigration backlash destabilize politics. Australia has so far avoided this, but the pressure is building. If housing becomes even more unaffordable, if wage growth continues lagging cost of living increases, political appetite for high immigration could evaporate quickly. The third assumption is that Australia can remain a safe haven while the world becomes more unstable. Climate change is hitting Australia hard. The 2019 to 2020 bushfire season burned 18 million hectares, destroyed thousands of homes, killed dozens of people, and hundreds of millions of animals. As fires, floods, and droughts intensify, the cost of climate adaptation will rise. Insurance becomes more expensive, infrastructure needs upgrading, entire regions may become unlivable. The safe haven image depends on stability, but climate change introduces profound instability that money alone can't solve. The real question isn't whether Australia is successful today. Clearly, it is. Median wealth per adult in Australia exceeds $300,000 as of 2025, among the highest globally. The question is whether the model that created that success can survive the next 30 years. Can an economy built on exporting resources to Asia thrive when Asia's growth slows? Can a nation dependent on immigration maintain social cohesion when housing is unaffordable? Can a safe haven remain safe when climate change makes parts of the continent uninhabitable? Australia's history shows adaptability. The country has transformed repeatedly, each time emerging stronger. But adaptation requires acknowledging when old models no longer work. The Australian settlement of the early 20th century, the protectionist compromise between labor and capital, eventually became unsustainable. It took a crisis and painful reforms to move forward. Today's model, resources plus immigration plus safe haven capital inflows, may also be reaching its limits. The question is whether Australia will recognize this before the next crisis forces recognition, or whether it will wait until circumstances leave no choice. Thanks for watching till the end. If you're here, you're one of those who want to understand how the financial system really works. Subscribe, new research tomorrow. And drop a comment. What do you think about this? Your perspective matters.